Hello and welcome to Make a Memory Bear. Today we're making Chauncey the Cat, the newest pattern in my collection, and it's a substantial pattern with a big old head, and it sits about 16 inches tall from the top of the head to the bottom, and it's super fun to make. Let's go over the list of supplies you'll need. Of course, you're going to need the pattern, which is available only in my Etsy shop, and the link to purchase is down below. You'll need a total of about 1 yard of fabric. You'll need matching thread, some pins, and scissors. If your cat's going to be around children or for a child, I highly recommend safety eyes and a nose. I'm using 15mm eyes and 20mm nose. You'll need a small bag of stuffing. And I'm making my pattern on my sewing machine, but this is certainly a pattern you can sew by hand too. Here are a couple of optional supplies. A seam ripper to make a starter hole for your eyes and nose, and some embroidery thread if you want to add eyelashes, whiskers, or mouth. If your fabric is particularly thin or stretchy or delicate, I highly recommend an iron-on fusible interfacing. And today I'll be demonstrating how to make a weighted cat with these stuffing pellets. Let's talk specifically about our fabric. Like I said, you'll need about 1 yard total. I am making a memory cat, which means I'm making it out of a loved one's clothing. And I've got these 2 dress shirts, which I love to use dress shirts. These are mostly cotton. It looks like they're cotton blends. And I find that they are pretty stiff. They don't have a lot of stretch to them, so they hold the shape of the cat really well. I also like that this is a random pattern. I either like random patterns or like solid fabrics because I find they're the easiest to work with. Stripes and plaids can be a little bit difficult just in lining them up so that all the stripes are going the right way. So these are my favorites. I also love using flannels, corduroys, lightweight denims, anything that's kind of stiff. Sometimes I use baby clothes like this little onesie or sleeper, but they are particularly stretchy. And you might be using a fabric like this or maybe old t-shirts or sweatshirts, things that are real stretchy. Those are going to be harder, and I highly recommend using an iron-on fusible interfacing for those. I'm going to be using this interfacing that I got on Amazon. It's 30 yards that came in this roll. To get started, print out your pattern at 100% on standard regular computer printer paper. And then cut the pattern pieces out on the solid line. And while we're talking about the pattern, if you're anything like me, you probably make these little memory bears and dogs and cats over and over and over again. The great news is that these paper patterns are yours once you purchase them forever, so you can print them out as often as you want to. But if they do get worn down or torn up over time, I saw another creator somewhere, YouTube, TikTok, somewhere, that showed this little hack that I love. You just get these little placemats either at Dollar Tree, or I picked mine up at Walmart, and they're like this flexible plastic material. And what I did was I took some adhesive, some spray adhesive, just sprayed it onto the back of each of the pattern pieces, laid it down on top of the plastic placemat, and then it cuts out so easily, and it makes it much more sturdy and durable in the end. So might be something that you want to consider as well to give a little bit of longer life to your pattern. And I was surprised at just how easily you can cut this material. I plan to keep mine in one of those big Ziploc bags along with a copy of the step-by-step instructions. You'll need a total of about 1 yard of fabric for our cat, and I'm going to be using 2 fabrics. And one is going to be for the accent pieces. The other one is for the bulk of the cat. So before I get started in cutting out my pattern pieces, I want to decide which fabric I'm going to use for which pieces. So fabric A is for the bulk of the cat. So that is the body and the head and the arms and the legs. So I'm grabbing all of those and setting those off with the solid fabric. And then for my accent pieces, the gusset, the muzzle, the tail, I'm going to cut those out of the patterned fabric. So I'm just setting those with that one before I get to cutting. And then the ear is the only one that needs 2 from fabric A and 2 from fabric B, so I'll be cutting out 2 pieces from each of my fabrics. Now if you look at the individual pattern pieces, they all say something like cut 2, 1 reverse, or cut 4, cut 2 reverse. Essentially what that means is, let's say you had a piece of fabric like this, just a single piece of fabric that has a right side and a wrong side, meaning there's the pattern on one side and nothing on the other. You would essentially lay this pattern piece down with the right side up, and you would cut out the pattern going this direction. Then you would flip your pattern piece over in reverse and cut it out a second time. However, I have found that it's much easier to simply fold your fabric in half, place the pattern piece on it, and then you only have to cut it out one time, and it automatically makes it so you have one forward like this and then one reversed. I also picked up these fabric pens that I've never used before, but I'm going to try them today to trace my patterns onto my fabric. So like I said before, I'm going to make sure that my fabric is doubled up so it's folded over. Then I'm going to place a couple of pins just to make sure that everything stays nice and flat. And I'm going to place my pattern piece on top of the fabric, take my new little fabric pen, and outline the pattern piece onto my fabric. I just fit my pattern pieces on in any direction I can onto my fabric, and it should look something like this when you're done. And then you cut them out. For pieces that say to only cut 1, I usually just do a single layer of fabric with the right side up. And if it's a patterned piece like this shirt is, I'm going to be mindful about where I place my pattern pieces so that I get a good portion of the design onto the piece that I'm cutting out. So since I've got these big oranges, I'm going to make sure that I get an orange or a little flower or something like that within the pattern piece that I'm cutting. And one other thing, on pieces that say cut 4, like the legs and the arms, instead of folding this fabric in half again and cutting all 4 out at once, I do just trace out my legs 2 times and my arms 2 times, because I found when you fold it over a 4th time, or like so that you can cut out 4 at once, that the lines and edges can get kind of wonky, and I don't like that. I want them to be clean. And as I'm cutting out my pieces, I'm just setting them off to the side with their pattern template on top, just because some of these pieces can look a lot like each other, surprisingly, so I want them to stay identified. And even though my fabric is pretty sturdy, some of this fabric is actually really thin, so I am using the iron-on interfacing today. You guys, if you don't have to use this, skip it. This took me forever and a day. I don't know what the best technique is. What I did is I cut out all my pieces from my fabric, as you saw, and then I ironed the interfacing onto the wrong side, like the inside of all of those fabric pieces, so that they'd be thicker and more sturdy. But then I had to cut them all out again, and it took me forever. So if you have a good, really solid fabric like the corduroy or like flannel shirts or something, or just anything that's thicker like minky even, and you don't have to use an interfacing, by all means skip this step. But if your fabric is thin like mine was, this is a game changer. It makes your fabric so much easier to sew with. It is worth it. So after I cut out all those pattern pieces again, I put them back in their little stacks with their pattern piece, and I am officially ready to sew. We're going to start with the ears. We'll take one piece from fabric A, one piece from fabric B. We're going to place those with the right sides together, and we're going to sew along the right and left side. We're going to leave the bottom edge open. You're going to notice throughout this video that I've gotten into the habit of kind of cutting off any unnecessary little corners. So you'll see here I'm clipping the bottom two corners of the ear and the tip of the ear to get rid of some of that bulk. And then I'm making little snips along both sides that I just sewed. That makes it so that when I turn these ears right side out, they're a little bit more flexible. They turn right side out a little bit easier. So that's your next step. Turn them right side out. Step 2 is attaching the ears to the gusset right here on the sides. This is the bottom down here where the muzzle goes, and we're going to be working up at the top, this wider section. You want to make sure that your fabric is right side up on your gusset, and your ears, when you sew them on, you want the same fabric as the gusset, so that's fabric B, to be facing up. These little triangles that are here on the ears, those line up with the top edge of the gusset. So that's where you're going to be pinning and sewing them into place. You only need to sew from that little triangle notch to the bottom of the ear. Step 3 is where we work on the sides of the head. So we're going to take our pieces with the right sides facing each other, and this long edge here is going to line up with the long edge of the gusset. Should match up perfectly. So right sides together, line that up, pop a couple of pins in it, and then we'll sew that straight line. And then we'll repeat the exact same process on the other side of the gusset with the second head piece. Okay, we're moving on to the muzzle, and this is a doozy. What we're going to do, we're going to take that muzzle piece. We are going to flip it upside down so that our right sides are together. We're going to line the center of the muzzle up with the center of the gusset, and we are going to place our first pin right there in the center. And then we are just going to, one side at a time, work our way around, attempting to put this muzzle into place. I use a lot of pins for this step, and what I'm doing the whole time is just sticking in a pin, then kind of flattening out my fabric, straightening it, stretching it, trying to put it into place, because as you can see, these are kind of going in, they're cut different directions, so it takes a little bit of finagling to make those edges line up. But just use a boatload of pins, take your time, and it'll be okay in the end. And this step is critical. There are some steps where I don't like to pin my fabric before I start sewing. This one, there's no getting around it. You've got to pin this down in order to make it stay while you're putting it under the sewing machine. So once you get done with that first side, just go back to the center and start doing the exact same thing on the second side of the muzzle. Now we're ready to sew it into place. And again, for this step, I'm just making sure that the fabric underneath and on top is laying flat, because it's real easy for it to get kind of bunched up underneath. So just stop regularly if you need to make sure that everything is going smoothly and that your fabric is nice and pulled taut and flat as you're sewing that edge. And then I like to give it just a quick once over to make sure that I didn't run off the fabric anywhere, because it is easy with all this bulky fabric in such a tight space. It is easy to kind of run off the rails a little bit. So I just want to make sure that it looks okay before we proceed. And like I did with the ears, I am going to cut the little corners off right here where the side of the head meets the muzzle at the end, and also where the gusset meets the muzzle. I'm going to clip those off. Plus I'm clipping little curves all around this curved edge. And that's not necessarily always something that I would do, but because I used all this interfacing and it's kind of thick and stiff now, I am going to cut some little curves because I want the face to open up and be nice and smooth when I stuff it in the end. So I'm clipping some curves here too. And now for the second part of the muzzle, we're going to be folding the face in on itself so that the right sides are together. And I'm going to take just a moment to make sure that the edges and the seams are lined up. And I will be using pins for this step. I'm going to be starting right up at the top point of that muzzle and pinning it into place. Then I also want to make sure, like I mentioned, that the seam at the bottom of the muzzle where it meets the neck is lined up so it looks clean once it's stuffed and all done. When I sew this snout part, I like to put my needle right there at the tip, right at the start of that seam down the center of the muzzle. And then I kind of pull away from that point and do my 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's because I want that to be kind of a sharp edge or a point so that I know where my nose needs to go in a few minutes. Next up is the face, which means we're going to be adding the safety eyes and nose. And I'm going to show you the way that I have found that it's the absolute easiest to put the eyes onto the cat so that they're in the same place on both sides, because sometimes you can get one high and one low and it looks kind of wonky. So if you fold the face in half, you'll notice on the pattern where I suggest you put the eye, but quite frankly, this is your cat, so you can put it wherever the heck you want. I'm going to pick my spot. I'm going to take my seam ripper. If I can get the lid off, I'm going to get the seam ripper and I'm going to put a teeny weeny little starter hole that goes through both sides of the face so that that starter hole is in the exact same position and I don't have to try to match it up, just eyeballing it. No pun intended. Now, if there's any chance that your cat is going to be around children, I highly recommend using the safety eyes and nose. And if you don't want to use safety eyes and noses, you could also use buttons from your person's clothing, or you could just embroider some on. I'm using 15 millimeter eyes. And I got mine on Amazon because I make a lot of memory bears and cats and dogs, so I buy the big kits. But you can also find these at craft stores in the doll making section or on Etsy. Same thing for the nose. I give you a suggested spot to put it, which means the bottom triangle of the nose covers up that little point that we have there at the top of the muzzle seam. So I'm going to put my starter hole right above that seam. I don't want to put it in the seam because that could tear out my stitches and then it'll unravel over time. But if I put a teeny weeny hole right above it, then the lower portion of the nose should cover up the start of our seam and it'll look great when it's done. I am using 20mm noses. I got these on Amazon and they're velvet and they're pink and they're precious for little kitties. Okay, we're going to come back around to the ears now, and we're going to sew them onto the head. So we have to fold the ear down and line up that edge of the ear with the edge of the head and put a couple pins there. So if you're using two fabrics like me, make sure that your pattern fabric, which is fabric B, is face down and touching the head fabric, which is fabric A. Just make sure the edges are lined up. Pop a couple pins in and we'll sew that down. Next is a super easy step. We're going to be sewing seam A on the front of the body. Seam A is the one that has this little triangle notch here. It's a long, straight seam. If you get confused, up at the top is the rounded neck. And we want the long, straight seam that has the little triangle up near the neck. This one's so easy, I'm not even going to pin it. I'm just popping it on the sewing machine and doing that straight seam. It's time to attach the front of the head to the body. So you want to flip the head upside down so that the right sides are together. I start right here at the center seam. Make sure that is lined up, the one that goes down the center of the head and the center of the body. Make sure that's lined up. Start by putting some pins there, then put them along the neck, and then we'll sew it into place. Next for the arms, I'm going to be separating the pieces into two separate arms, and I'll have the right sides of the fabric together, and it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to be sewing all around the curved sides of the arm, and we will leave that straight edge open so we can stuff it next. As before, I'm going to cut those little corner pieces off and then I'm going to clip the curves. I'm going to put a couple little snips all around these curvy edges. And then turn the arms right side out. We're going to stuff the arms next. And I like, personally, to add a lot of stuffing right at the hand so that it's filling out that curve and it has a nice smooth appearance. Plus, I just like the feel of it. And then as I'm stuffing the arm, I put a little bit less stuffing in so it's a little more squishy. And then right at the edge where the arm is going to be sewn onto the body, I do not put any stuffing there because I want to be able to get this arm under the sewing machine and I can't do it if it's stuffed. So now we're ready to attach the arms to the body of the cat, and I'm going to give you two different options. So the way that the pattern is written is that you would simply line the edge of the arm up with the edge of the body right up here next to the head and sew straight across. And it just kind of flaps open like that. The other option would be you fold the arm in half so that that seam is matching up on the front and the back of the arm. You lay it like this. It's a little bit awkward because it's not written this way, but it kind of gives almost like a bear hug look to the cat when it's done. Here, I'm going to show you two options. So this guy was made the way the pattern is written, and you can see how the arms are shaped and how they flap. And then, come here. This guy, I did the other way so that I kind of turned the arms and they almost have a more rounded appearance, kind of do a bear hug kind of motion. Just another option for you, just in case you want to try something different. For our tutorial today, though, I'm going to be doing it the standard way, how the pattern is written. So I'm going to pin the arm into place and sew it onto the body. Just like we did with the arms, we're going to be separating our 4 leg pieces into 2 distinct legs, and we're going to sew all around the perimeter. However, we do have these 2 triangle notches that we are not going to sew between. Do not sew here. That makes a stuffing hole for us. So my pattern pieces were sticking together so nicely. I did not even bother using pins on this step, but by all means, you can use pins if you want to, but just sew around the perimeter, not between the triangle notches. Just make sure you've got your little stuffing hole, and then take your scissors and put a couple of little clips all around the curved edges. And then we turn our feet right side out. All right, we're ready to attach the legs to the body. And you'll see that there's this little triangle notch on the body. That tells you where the bottom of the leg should line up with the body for attachment. So I place it so that the leg is laying across the body, and then I'm going to pin it and sew it along the edge. But you're going to realize that we've got a straight leg and a round body, so it doesn't exactly line up. You have the corners kind of hanging off. That's totally fine. Just go ahead and pin it into place, and then what I do is when it's time to sew, I will flip it over so that my cat is face down, and then I can follow the curve of the body with my sewing machine. And then when I'm done, I just snip those little corners off. Here's what your cat should look like at this point. The next step is the back of the head, and this is an easy one. It's just this long straight seam A with the little triangle notch. The tail is made almost identical to the arms. So you put the right sides together, you sew around this curved edge, leave the straight edge open, and then we'll clip the curves and turn it right side out and stuff it. When it comes to turning the tail right side out, it is a long skinny tube essentially, and with this interfacing on my fabric, it was stiff and it was tight. So you might need to get something like a pencil and use the eraser edge or some other blunt object to help you get it through, because this was a tight one. The pencil also came in handy when I was stuffing it so that I could get the stuffing all the way to the tip of the tail. And just like with the arm, I did not put any stuffing where it meets the body. And then you can just set the tail aside for a later step. Now we're ready to move on to the back of the body. So we're going to start by separating our two back pieces into single layers of fabric. I like to do them mirror images like this so that the little triangle notches are facing towards each other with the right sides up. And we're going to start with this dart. So you're going to fold the fabric on itself so the right sides are together. Then we're just going to pin and sew straight across on each side. So your two back pieces should look like this once you do the darts. And now we're ready to go back to the tail. You have two options for attaching the tail. You can do it like this so that it kind of swoops up, right, like that. Or you can turn it on its side so that that seam lines up right in the middle. And this way it kind of curves around the cat when it's done. So your choice, however you want to do it. Either way, we're going to put it between this bottom triangle notch and the new dart that we just sewed. I like to just pin it into place with one or two pins. And then the next step is we're going to pin both back pieces together, and the tail is going to be sandwiched in between. So I like to start up at the top, and I put one or two pins right up here above that top triangle. And then we're going to skip between the two triangles because that is going to become our stuffing hole at the very end. So don't sew there. And then we're going to sew together the bottom half where this tail is. I do take a moment to make sure that the darts are lined up because that's going to become kind of the bottom of the cat. So I want that to be nice and straight. So I put a couple pins in there, and then I go back to the tail. I remove those ones that I used to temporarily hold it into place, and then I put them where they need to be. Stick a couple more pins at the very bottom to make sure that the little point lines up, and then we're ready to go. We'll just sew that in place. For the next step, we're going to attach the back of the head to the back of the body. And we do this just like we did with the front of the head and the front of the body. We'll flip the head upside down. And I like to start right in the center to make sure that seam is lined up. Pop some pins in, and then we'll sew that seam. We are ready for the biggest step in the whole project, which is attaching the front of the body to the back of the body. So what I like to do is fold the face in half. I just line those ears up and those seams up, and I want to make a tiny little notch right there so that I know where the exact center of the face is, because I want that to line up directly with the center of the back of the head so that my head doesn't get sewn on cockeyed or lopsided. So I line that tiny little notch up with the center seam that goes down the back of the head, and that's where I start pinning first. Now, I will say that pinning the head together takes a little of finagling. I put a lot of pins in. I do a lot of stretching and tugging to make sure that the edges line up perfectly before I sew it into place. I think that it's a good idea to go over to the sides of the head, like where they meet at the neck, and make sure that that seam is lined up, because that's a pretty critical one. And so I'll put pins on the sides, and then I just work to make sure that the back of the head and the front of the head line up, just kind of pulling, stretching. Sometimes I even kind of make the face, I push it in so it makes like a little bowl, and that helps the edges come together a little bit nicer. But just take your time and work until all those edges are lined up and pinned into place. Use as many pins as you need. When I move down to the body of the cat, I want to be really mindful that I've got everything tucked in and out of the way so that it doesn't get caught up in the seam. So I'm tucking the arms and the legs in, up into the belly. Also with the tail, I find that it's best if I kind of stick it through the stuffing hole so it's out of the way. We don't want anything to get caught up in the seam. And then I go down to the bottom, just like I did at the top of the head. I'm going to make sure that the seam that lines up on the front and back of the body is lined up. So I'll start by putting pins there, and then just like with the head, I'm going to go all the way around, pinning until it's completely together. While you're watching me pin this together, I do want to point out that if you find that it's just too difficult for you to pin and then sew the body together with the arms stuffed, you don't have to do it that way. You could do it just like we did the legs and leave stuffing holes, and you could stuff them at the very end and then hand sew the stuffing holes closed. I like to start sewing the body right here up at the top of the head. That just seems like an obvious place to start for some reason to me. So that's what we're going to do. I do use a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. I do take my time. It is a little bit cumbersome with those stuffed arms, which is why I was saying you can opt to stuff them at the end. I just despise hand sewing, especially at the end of the project when I just want to be done with this thing. I do not want to have to hand sew. So that's why I try to make as few stuffing holes as possible, but you could totally stuff them at the end, and that makes this step significantly easier, because you'll see when I'm doing this that when you get around the arms, it's a little chunky and it's real easy to fall off the rails and not keep your 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout, trying to get those chunky arms under the footer. I like to give it a quick once over to make sure there aren't any holes, and then I start turning the cat right side out. I start with all the stuffed parts first, so the tail and the arms, and then I move on to pulling the legs through and the head through. So making a beanbag with weighted stuffing pellets is totally optional, but I highly recommend it. I started doing this about a year ago, and I love the weight that it gives to the stuffed animals, plus the stability it gives them so that they sit upright. And I just grab some of my leftover material and I make kind of a teardrop shape, but the shape doesn't matter. Just make a little bag. I'm just going to zip around the perimeter. I'm going to leave that top seam open so that I can stuff it with my weighted pellets. And then I will stick it back under the sewing machine and close up that seam too. I made a little funnel out of paper so that it would make this step a little bit easier. And also the pellets that I bought on Amazon had that really handy little spout. So it made it easy to get the pellets inside the bag. And then I sewed it closed. And then for the time being, I'm just going to take my little bean bag and I'm going to set it into the bottom of the body while I go ahead and stuff the rest of the cat. I like to start with the face and head of the cat, and I put a lot of stuffing in the muzzle. I also prefer a lot of stuffing in the head and in the neck. I personally like my stuffed animals to have really firm, solid heads. And then when I move on to the body, I'm making sure that the bean bag is where it needs to be so that the body is well positioned so it sits upright. And you can make the body as squishy as you like it. And then my final step is to do the legs. Just like when we were doing the arms, I like to put a lot of stuffing at the feet so that those curves kind of get straightened out. And then I put less stuffing in the leg and almost no stuffing where it attaches to the body so that it can move freely. And then the final step is just to close up those stuffing holes. And I do this with a matching thread and a needle, and we do this by hand. I do a ladder stitch for these. If you've never done a ladder stitch before, I will link a really well done tutorial down below of a lady that shows you how to do this. You can't really see on mine because my thread matches my fabric so well, but essentially you're going back and forth, you pull your thread and it makes an invisible stitch, which is really cool. You can also just do a whip stitch. It doesn't matter. We just need to sew closed the holes. And then we're done. There's no more sewing, so at this point it's just all about accessorizing. So you could add a little bow in the hair on top of the head. If it's a little girl cat, you could put iron-on appliques. You could sew on some little patches or things that are meaningful to you or to your loved one. You could put a bow around the neck like this. If you had a little cat collar, look at this little cat collar I've got. You could put that on your little kitty. Anything you want to do to make it your own, to personalize it and make it really cute, now's the time to do that. And here's the final product. A really cute and substantial cat. It measures about 15 inches from the top of the head to the bottom, but it feels much bigger. So in comparison, if you've ever made one of my other big bears like Chipper, you can see the head is just significantly bigger, making it feel more substantial. And that's it, folks. We are totally done. I hope you love this new pattern, and thank you so much for watching.